So, over the weekend, there was a Hollywood-style heist at a bank in a small town near Frankfurt, Germany, whose name I'm not going to try and pronounce, in which the criminals decided to not go through the funnel of the bank into the vault, but over the holiday weekend, they decided to go into the parking garage that's adjacent to the bank itself and drill through the wall of the parking garage into the bank vault. In so doing, they fundamentally bypassed all the alarms, right? Because, again, we'll talk about front-heavy security later, but right off the bat, this tells you one of two things, possibly both, that there was either a lot of planning that went into this to study the architectural designs of the buildings and how they're married together, or there's some insider information, because you would know exactly which wall and exactly which location and spot to drill through. And if you look at the image here, you can see how small of a window they actually had. So this was either somebody who had insider knowledge, somebody who had done a lot of embedded reconnaissance. In this case, embedded reconnaissance might be something like opening up a bank, going into the vault to open your own safety deposit box, getting in there as a customer, and then mapping out the location with GPS coordinates or something else. Or they just really studied the architectural design, but I doubt that just because of how precise this had to be. Now, some interesting things about this heist was that they planned it over the holiday weekend, which is smart from the attacker's standpoint, simply because, well, security is going to be lax. There's a lot of idiots who are going to be shooting off fireworks and other things, so you've got a lot of EMS and things that are preoccupied other places. Now, the interesting thing about this is that they did drill through the parking garage into the bank vault. And apparently, on Saturday, they set off a fire alarm. And this is where we get into basically just complacency. So they set off a fire alarm. Either police or security did show up on site. I've seen this a million times, where police or security, they show up, they look around, they walk around the building, they don't see any obvious damage or break-ins or anything else. They turn off the alarm and they leave. That is complacency, and that's if that is true, which was reported by the AP and other news organizations, if that part is true, that is a colossal failure on the defensive side of this security apparatus. Now, according to reports, there's about 3,000 safety deposit boxes inside this bank vault, and the bad guys spent the entire weekend breaking into 95% of them before Monday morning setting off another fire alarm in which security actually showed up, actually did its job, found the break-in, and reported it or actually did something about it. Now, in a bit of a humorous twist, the thieves actually had their vehicles stationed inside the parking garage the entire weekend, and they paid their fees. They paid their parking fees over the weekend. So it is kind of an interesting twist that while committing bank robbery, actual bank robbery, you are paying for your parking fees over the entire weekend. So I just thought that was kind of a funny twist. All right, now let's talk a little bit about front-heavy security. So front-heavy security is you put all the security of the building at the key locations and checkpoints that you expect people to come in. So there's a funnel of expected orientation where people are going to go from the outside of the building to the inside of the building to certain locations in the building. That flow of personnel is what we refer to as the funnel. And with front-heavy security, what you've done is that you've taken all the security, the checkpoints, the PAC systems, the alarms, the cameras, everything, and you've put them kind of at the choke points where you expect people to come through. The dangerous part of doing this is that any person who goes another way that's not in the funnel, if they go through an open window or if they find a rear door, or in this case, they go through a wall, then there's no security, right? So, and the other problem with front-heavy security is that there's this concept with most personnel inside secure buildings that any person who has gotten beyond those checkpoints is assumed to be allowed to be there because, well, how else did you get this far into the building? So any person who's inside of a building, whether it's a bank or a government office or anything else, and they're beyond the choke points or they're beyond the checkpoints, nobody ever tends to check them. Nobody ever notices and says, hey, I don't know you, or you're not wearing a badge properly, or that badge that you look kind of looks funny. Nothing like that tends to happen because it's not people's jobs. And as a result, it's really important that you do not exercise front-heavy security when you're trying to secure a building, because if you do and the bad guys find another way to get into the building that bypasses your security, well, you're screwed. Now, the other aspect of this is just complacency. And you see this I see this all the time when I'm doing pen testing on locations, because what you'll typically see is when an alarm goes off, most people have this idea that when an alarm is triggered, what ought to happen is police or on-site security or somebody come running down the hallway. Their response time is moments or seconds, and they're on you immediately and the jig is up, right? But a lot of times what ends up happening is not that. A lot of times when alarms go off in buildings, what ends up happening is complacency, where one, does anybody even care or notice? I've seen instances where alarms go off for the entire evening and nobody shows up, and the alarm will eventually just turn off. But a lot of times when people do actually take notice of the alarms, they treat it like a car alarm, where it's more of a nuisance than actually an alert that, hey, something's wrong. And in this instance, if what was reported in the news is correct, and the thieves actually set off an initial alarm, a fire alarm, when they came in on Saturday, and police or security, somebody responded, then what likely happened is they walked the outside perimeter of the building, they checked the doors to make sure they were still locked, they didn't see any broken windows, they didn't see any broken doors, everything was still locked up, they probably thought it was just a false alarm, turned off the alarm, and left. And that's probably what happened. Because if they had have gone to the vault, they would have noticed the big hole sticking out of the side of the wall, right? So when you have these kinds of complacency things, this is one of the ways that actually it creates an avenue of approach. I did a high security facility once where, sitting at a kebab shop across the street at like 6 in the morning, we had noticed that there was a security guard who came out every morning at 6 a.m. He'd go out to the perimeter door, he'd open the door, he'd say something on the radio, go to the next perimeter door, open the door, say something on the radio, and we figured out what he was doing was at shift change at 6 a.m., he would be forced, because of standard operating procedure, to walk the perimeter of the building, open every single door, and call the physical SOC or facility manager, whoever, and said, I opened door number 5. Did you see door 5 open? I opened door 6. Did you see 6 open? And that's a great standard operating procedure. But one of the many ways we were able to get into that building was because there was a couple of these doors that were older and that were at corners of the building where he would open the door fully. He would say something, he would do this little comms check, and then he'd round the corner and just let the door go. And that door would take 20, 30 seconds to close. And you can immediately see it would be trivial for someone to slip right through there. And because he's doing the check at that moment, the alarm's already gone off, and the physical SOC or the facility manager, whoever, it just says, oh yeah, that alarm, we know what that was. So they're not really keeping an eye out for it. So what I'm getting at here is your complacency and your standard operating procedures that are kind of robust can themselves create vulnerabilities. And that seems to be what happened here. But one of the things that I want to talk about is when you're running a pen test, when you're running a physical pen test, a black team, a physical red team, whatever the hell you want to call it, when you're running one of these engagements, I want you to think of two things. When you're talking about corporations, whether it's a bank, whether it's a pension company, a government office, whatever, the general rule of thumb is this. If your client deals in physical merchandise, there are laptop sales, a car dealership, a bank with a vault, etc. If your client deals with that type of things, your chief threat is probably somebody who's going to smash and grab their stuff, right? I know people don't think of museums as like merchandise, but that's basically what they are. And that's what you saw with the Louvre heist, right? Nobody's breaking into the Louvre to do corporate espionage. They're breaking into the Louvre. They're breaking into banks. They're breaking into these kinds of places to steal money. That's what they're doing, steal stuff. If, however, you're talking about like Google headquarters or the FBI headquarters or things like this, then you're getting into espionage. Then you're getting into, they're not breaking into the Microsoft headquarters to steal laptops. They're breaking into bug workstations or steal, intellectual property or something along those lines. So right off the bat, know what your client's risks are. But beyond that, take a look at these two cases. So one, insider threats. Insider threats account for a colossal amount of corporate espionage. And two, physical threats, like what you have here in the bank heist. So when you are running a physical pen test, something that I want you to keep all physical pen testers in their minds, would your assessment, would your solutions for your client have prevented or even noticed this possible method of entry for the bank, Or would you have actually noticed and be able to stop insider threats? Insider threats are some of the most nefarious, difficult to stop things. But when you're running a physical pen test, be sure that you think about both insider threats and outsider threats. And while obviously on a physical pen test, you're never going to be allowed to blow through a wall, you should at least, especially if you're doing a physical audit, you should note these things. You should this is the whole point of walking around the building. This is the whole point of, trying to find all possible vulnerabilities, because you never know. But if this bank job turns out to be an insider threat, which I kind of suspect that it was either insider threat or at a bare minimum, it was some type of embedded reconnaissance where somebody comes in and they open up a bank account and they, open a safety deposit box so they can get into that vault room so that they can, map out exactly where that wall is. That's my guess. But in either case, it's likely you needed insider knowledge to get that far. So if you do that, the question is, when you're running a pen test or an audit or anything else, did your remediations to the client, would they have stopped insider threats? It's a really hard thing. But when you're running a pen test or when you're running an audit, really think about that threat scenario, because the vast majority of clients that you will deal with will be concerned mostly with intellectual property theft or corporate espionage or similar, not stuff that's stolen. Now, yes, stuff that's stolen is always a risk, of course, but again, most people are not going to be breaking into Google headquarters for laptops. They're going to be breaking into places like that because they want to steal stuff, or they want to disrupt environments or anything else, but that's a different category. But think about it. Just when you're doing these pen tests, when you're doing these audits, when you're doing these risk assessments, think about both insider threats and embedded reconnaissance, right? So like, how could somebody actually get into the vault? So don't do your client a disservice and only look at the situation from guy in a balaclava sneaks in the middle of the night, or tailgating into the office in the middle of the day, and that's the entire assessment. It can't be the entire assessment. You have to give your clients a full picture of all the possible routes that a bad guy could take, either from the outside of the building or the inside of the building, to wherever that client's crown jewels are.